At 03:15 on the morning of January 17, 1991, 7 massive aircraft thundered down the runway at Barksdale Air Force Base in Louisiana. Their swept wings stretched 185 feet across, wider than a Boeing 747. Their 8 engines left trails of fire against the dark sky. The ground crew watched as the bombers climbed into the darkness and turned east, beginning what would become the longest combat mission in aviation history. 35 hours and 14,000 miles later, after crossing the Atlantic Ocean, skirting the Mediterranean, and flying across Saudi Arabia, those same aircraft launched 35 cruise missiles at targets deep inside Iraq. Then they turned around and flew home without ever landing. The crews had been airborne for nearly a day and a half, refueling multiple times from tanker aircraft along the way. Those bombers were B-52s. And here is what makes that fact extraordinary. The youngest of those 7 aircraft had rolled off the assembly line in October 1962. They were already 29 years old when they fired the opening shots of Operation Desert Storm. They had been built during the Eisenhower administration, when Elvis Presley was still recording his first albums, and John F. Kennedy was a senator from Massachusetts. Today, more than 3 decades after that historic mission over Iraq, those same aircraft are still flying, not museum pieces gathering dust, not training aids for mechanics, combat-ready warplanes that have dropped precision munitions on Islamic State fighters in Syria, provided close air support over the mountains of Afghanistan, and stood nuclear alert against potential adversaries. The United States Air Force plans to keep them flying until the 2060s, when some of these bombers will approach 100 years of continuous service. This is the story of the B-52 Stratofortress, the bomber that everyone declared obsolete, the aircraft that outlived every single machine designed to replace it, the warplane that has flown combat missions in 8 different conflicts across 7 decades, dropped millions of tons of ordnance on 3 continents, and simply refuses to die. It is a story that begins not in a factory or a military laboratory, but in a hotel room in Dayton, Ohio, over a single October weekend in 1948, when a group of desperate engineers built a model airplane out of balsa wood and changed military aviation forever. On November 23, 1945, just 3 months after Japan surrendered and World War II ended, the United States Army Air Forces issued a formal requirement for a new strategic bomber. The military wanted an aircraft capable of carrying nuclear weapons from American bases to targets deep inside the Soviet Union without needing to refuel at foreign airfields. The specifications called for a range of at least 5,000 miles, while carrying a 10,000-pound bomb load, with cruising speeds of at least 300 miles per hour at altitudes above 35,000 feet. The contract would eventually go to Boeing, the legendary company that had built the B-17 Flying Fortress and B-29 Superfortress during the war. Boeing had experience creating large, long-range bombers and had won the initial competition with a design they designated Model 462. But the path from contract to completed aircraft proved tortuous. Between 1946 and 1948, Boeing cycled through at least 7 major redesigns. The original concept was a massive straight-winged turboprop weighing 360,000 pounds, powered by 6 experimental Wright T-35 engines. The Air Force examined the proposal and rejected it as inadequate. Boeing proposed alternatives with different engine configurations. The Air Force changed its requirements repeatedly. The program came within days of complete cancellation in December 1947, saved only when Boeing President William Allen personally flew to Washington to appeal to Secretary of the Air Force Stuart Symington. The breakthrough came during one of aviation's most celebrated weekends in history. On Thursday, October 21, 1948, Boeing aerodynamicist George Scherer and 2 colleagues presented their latest turboprop design to Colonel Henry E. Worden at Wright Field in Dayton, Ohio. Worden examined the proposal carefully. He was unimpressed. The colonel asked the Boeing team a simple question. Could they design an all-jet aircraft instead of the turboprop they kept proposing? Scherer called his colleague Ed Wells, Boeing's vice president of engineering, who caught a flight to Dayton that very evening. Over the next 4 days, 6 Boeing engineers worked feverishly in 2 rooms at the Hotel Van Cleve, a 12-story building at 36 West 1st Street in downtown Dayton. The team included Scherer, Wells, Art Carlson, Vaughn Blumenthal, Bob Withington, and Maynard Pennell. The hotel had been built in the 1920s and would eventually be demolished in 1969, but for one October weekend, it became the birthplace of the most enduring combat aircraft in history. The engineers had no drafting tables, they had no engineering equipment, they had no computers, which barely existed in 1948 anyway. They had hotel room, furniture, pencils, paper, and determination. Scherer walked down the street to a local hobby shop and purchased balsa wood, glue, carving tools, and silver paint. Using a 12-inch ruler at a scale of 1 inch to 10 feet, the team spent hours constructing a 14-inch handcrafted model of what would become the B-52. They gave it swept wings angled at 35 degrees. They hung 8 jet engines in 4 underwing pods, 2 engines per pod. They designed a bicycle-style landing gear, with the main wheels arranged in tandem under the fuselage and small outrigger wheels at the wingtips to prevent the aircraft from tipping over on the ground. The design was essentially a scaled-up version of Boeing's B-47 medium bomber, which was already showing great promise. The team calculated performance figures, estimated weights, and drafted specifications throughout the weekend. A local stenographer was hired to type a clean 33-page proposal. On Monday morning, Scherer presented the bound document and the silver-painted balsa model to Colonel Warden. The officer studied the design carefully, turned the model over in his hands, and examined the swept wings and engine pods. Then he looked up at the exhausted Boeing engineers and declared that now they finally had an airplane. This was the B-52. The final aircraft that Boeing would build over the following 14 years looked almost identical to that hotel room model. The prototype, designated YB-52, made its maiden flight on April 15, 1952, nearly 4 years after that legendary hotel room weekend. Boeing test pilot Alvin Melvin Johnston, known universally as Tex, sat in the left seat with Air Force Lieutenant Colonel Guy Townsend as co-pilot. They flew the aircraft for approximately 3 hours from Boeing Field in Seattle to Larson Air Force Base in Washington state. The second prototype, the XB-52, had actually been completed first but was delayed by a pneumatic system explosion during ground testing. It finally flew on October 2, 1952. Boeing ultimately produced 744 B-52s across 10 different variants, designated by letters A through H. Manufacturing took place at plants in Seattle, Washington, and Wichita, Kansas. The assembly lines ran continuously for over a decade. The total program cost approximately $4.5 billion, which would equal roughly $70 billion in today's money adjusted for inflation. The first operational B-52, a reconnaissance variant designated RB-52B, was delivered to the 93rd Bombardment Wing at Castle Air Force Base in California on June 29, 1955. The last B-52H rolled off the Wichita assembly line on October 26, 1962. Every single B-52 flying combat missions today was built before the Cuban Missile Crisis. The production line has been closed for over 60 years. The aircraft that emerged from that Dayton hotel room design session was a technological marvel of the early jet age. The B-52H, the only variant still in active service, stretches over 159 feet from nose to tail. That distinctive swept wing spans 185 feet from tip to tip. Empty, the aircraft weighs approximately 185,000 pounds. Fully loaded for a combat mission with fuel and weapons, it can reach 488,000 pounds. That is more than twice the weight of a fully loaded Boeing 737 passenger jet. 8 Pratt & Whitney TF-33 turbofan engines generate a combined thrust of over 136,000 pounds, pushing the aircraft to speeds up to 650 miles per hour at high altitude and a maximum ceiling above 50,000 feet. Its unrefueled combat range exceeds 8,800 miles, meaning a B-52 can take off from Louisiana, fly to targets in Eastern Europe, and return home without landing or refueling. With aerial refueling support from tanker aircraft, the range becomes effectively unlimited. Most importantly, the B-52 can carry an astonishing 70,000 pounds of weapons, both internally in its massive bomb bay and externally on wing pylons. That payload capacity exceeds every bomber that came before it, and every bomber designed to replace it. The B-52 Stratofortress was built for one terrifying purpose: delivering thermonuclear weapons against targets inside the Soviet Union. Under President Dwight Eisenhower's new-look defense strategy, which emphasized nuclear deterrence over conventional forces, Strategic Air Command built its entire doctrine around the bomber. SAC's commanding general, Curtis LeMay, believed that maintaining overwhelming nuclear striking power was the only way to prevent World War III. The B-52 became his instrument of deterrence. At peak strength during the early 1960s, Strategic Air Command maintained approximately 650 B-52s across 42 squadrons at 38 bases throughout the United States and allied nations in Europe and the Pacific. Bombers sat on alert pads around the clock, loaded with thermonuclear weapons and ready to launch within 15 minutes of receiving orders. On May 21, 1956, a B-52 became the first aircraft in history to drop a live hydrogen bomb during an operational test. The bomber released a thermonuclear device during the Cherokee test at Bikini Atoll in the Pacific Ocean, demonstrating that the weapon system worked exactly as designed. The most extraordinary expression of the nuclear mission was Operation Chrome Dome, which ran from 1961 through 1968. Under this continuous operation, B-52s maintained 24-hour airborne nuclear alert, meaning bombers carrying live thermonuclear weapons were in the air at every moment of every day for 7 straight years. At any given time during Chrome Dome, approximately 12 fully armed bombers orbited along predetermined routes spanning the Arctic approaches to the Soviet Union, the Atlantic Ocean, and the Mediterranean Sea. Each flight lasted up to 24 hours and covered approximately 10,000 miles, with multiple aerial refueling contacts from KC-135 Stratotanker aircraft. The crews endured grueling conditions that tested human endurance to its limits. They flew at a pressurized cabin altitude of 12,000 feet, where coffee went cold within minutes and water tasted stale after just a few hours. The constant drone of 8 jet engines created a numbing background roar that lasted an entire day. Men tried to sleep in uncomfortable ejection seats while wearing bulky survival equipment, their bodies cramped in positions that left them sore for days afterward. The B-52 of that era carried a crew of 6. The aircraft commander and co-pilot sat in the upper deck cockpit with its distinctive wrap around windscreen. Behind them sat the electronic warfare officer, monitoring Soviet radar frequencies and ready to activate jamming equipment. Below in the windowless lower compartment sat the navigator, bombardier, and tail gunner, surrounded by instruments and isolated from any view of the outside world. Every crew member knew the stakes. The sealed metal box in the cockpit contained top-secret authorization codes. If those codes were transmitted, it meant nuclear war had begun. They trained constantly for that moment, hoping it would never come. During the Cuban Missile Crisis in October 1962, Strategic Air Command surged Chrome Dome operations to their highest intensity. 66 B-52s orbited simultaneously, each armed with multiple hydrogen bombs plus AGM-28 Hound Dog nuclear cruise missiles. For 13 days, as President Kennedy and Soviet Premier Khrushchev confronted each other over nuclear missiles in Cuba, those bombers circled at their fail-safe points, waiting for orders that fortunately never came. Operation Chrome Dome ended abruptly on January 21, 1968. That night, a B-52 carrying 4 thermonuclear weapons suffered an onboard fire during a routine patrol mission. The crew could not control the blaze and was forced to bail out. The bomber crashed on the sea ice approximately 7 miles southwest of Thule Air Base in Greenland. The impact scattered radioactive contamination across the frozen landscape. The secondary stage of one weapon was never recovered and is believed to remain embedded in the ice and sediment at the bottom of North Star Bay. The accident forced a complete re-evaluation of airborne nuclear alert procedures, and Chrome Dome was terminated the following day. This was one of at least 6 major nuclear accidents involving B-52s during the Cold War. The most frightening occurred 3 years earlier, on January 24, 1961, over rural North Carolina. A B-52G carrying two Mark 39 hydrogen bombs was flying a routine airborne alert mission when it suffered a catastrophic structural failure. The right wing separated from the fuselage, and the bomber broke apart in mid-air over Goldsboro, North Carolina. Both nuclear weapons fell free from the disintegrating aircraft. One bomb deployed its parachute and landed relatively intact. The other plunged into a muddy field without its parachute and buried itself so deep that the Air Force was never able to fully recover it. The weapon's uranium core remains underground to this day. When investigators examined the recovered bomb, they discovered something terrifying. The weapon had been a single low-voltage safety switch away from full detonation. That switch was the only thing that had prevented a nuclear explosion over American soil. The Mark 39 carried a yield of 3.8 megatons, 250 times more powerful than the bomb that destroyed Hiroshima in 1945. Ground-based nuclear alert continued until September 27, 1991, when President George H.W. Bush announced that all B-52s would stand down from their continuous alert posture. The order ended over 3 decades of nuclear readiness and marked a symbolic conclusion to the Cold War. By the mid-1960s, the nature of warfare was changing dramatically, and the B-52 was about to undergo an unexpected transformation from nuclear doomsday machine to conventional workhorse. On June 18, 1965, 30 B-52F bombers launched from Andersen Air Force Base on the island of Guam, beginning what would become an 8-year campaign of sustained conventional bombing. Their target was a suspected Viet Cong stronghold near Ben Cat in South Vietnam. The mission was designated Operation Arc Light. The operation began with tragedy. During pre-refueling maneuvering over the Pacific, as aircraft circled waiting for tankers, 2 B-52s collided in mid-air, killing all 8 crewmen aboard the 2 aircraft. These were the first B-52 losses of the Vietnam War. The remaining 27 bombers pressed on to their targets and completed the mission, but post-strike reconnaissance revealed the enemy had already abandoned the area. Despite this inauspicious start, Arc Light expanded relentlessly over the following 8 years. B-52s flew from 2 primary bases. Andersen Air Force Base on Guam was over 2,500 miles from targets in Vietnam, meaning each mission lasted 10 to 12 hours each way, with multiple aerial refueling contacts. U Tapao Royal Thai Navy Airfield in Thailand was much closer, cutting flight time to just 2 or 3 hours each direction. The B-52D model became the primary conventional bombing workhorse after a modification program in December 1965 dramatically increased its internal bomb capacity. The modification, nicknamed Big Belly, removed the nuclear weapon carriage equipment from the bomb bay and installed conventional bomb racks that could hold up to 84 500-pound bombs internally, plus 24 more on external pylons. Each aircraft could carry 108 bombs, weighing approximately 60,000 pounds total. 3 aircraft flew together in formations called cells, approaching targets from altitudes above 30,000 feet, where they were invisible and inaudible to anyone on the ground. B-52 strikes could saturate a target box measuring 1 by 2 kilometers, overlapping craters and flattening everything within the strike zone. By mid-1967, B-52s maintained an operational tempo of 800 sorties per month. That number climbed steadily as the war intensified. The B-52's most dramatic Vietnam combat occurred during the siege of Khe Sanh, a remote Marine Corps combat base near the border with Laos. From January through March 1968, approximately 6,000 American Marines faced an estimated 20,000 North Vietnamese troops who had surrounded the base and were systematically tightening the noose. B-52s provided continuous around-the-clock support, flying approximately 60 sorties daily throughout the siege. The bombing was so intense and delivered with such precision that enemy soldiers could not mass for attacks without being destroyed. The strikes fell within mere hundreds of yards of American defensive positions, closer than any previous bomber support in military history. Artillery observers on the ground would mark targets with smoke rounds, and within hours B-52s would obliterate the coordinates with devastating accuracy. Captured North Vietnamese prisoners reported devastating casualties from the airstrikes. Some described entire battalions being caught in the open during troop movements and annihilated before they could disperse. Others spoke of bunker complexes being collapsed by the sheer force of the bombing, burying everyone inside. The psychological impact was equally severe. Soldiers who survived B-52 attacks described trembling uncontrollably for hours afterward, unable to eat or function normally. General William Westmoreland, commander of all American forces in Vietnam, later declared that the thing that broke the enemy's back at Khe Sanh was the fire of the B-52s. But nothing in the bomber's entire history compares to Operation Linebacker II, the campaign that would become known as the Christmas bombings of 1972. By December of that year, peace negotiations between the United States and North Vietnam had completely collapsed. President Richard Nixon faced a hostile new Congress that would take office in January 1973 and almost certainly cut off all funding for the war. Nixon needed to force Hanoi back to the negotiating table immediately. He ordered maximum-effort B-52 strikes against the most heavily defended cities in North Vietnam, Hanoi and Haiphong. The force assembled for this desperate gamble was staggering: 207 B-52s, representing nearly half the Air Force's entire bomber fleet, deployed to Andersen Air Force Base on Guam and Utapao in Thailand. Additional fighter escorts, electronic warfare aircraft, tankers, and rescue helicopters supported the operation. It was the largest concentration of American bomber strength since World War II. The first 3 nights were catastrophic for the attacking forces. Strategic Air Command headquarters at Offutt Air Force Base in Nebraska maintained rigid tactical control over the operation, dictating exact routes, altitudes, formations, and timing. The tactics were designed for nuclear strikes against the Soviet Union, where getting bombs on target was all that mattered because there would be no follow-up missions. They were completely unsuited for conventional operations requiring sustained attacks against an adaptive enemy. SAC sent bombers along identical routes night after night. Aircraft flew at identical altitudes in identical formations. Post-target turns designed to escape nuclear blast effects slowed the bombers and pointed their electronic jamming equipment away from enemy missiles. The North Vietnamese air defense system around Hanoi and Haiphong was the most sophisticated outside the Soviet Union itself. They operated SA-2 guideline missiles supplied by Moscow, with Soviet technical advisors helping to refine tactics. By the third night of Linebacker II, the defenders had cracked the American patterns completely. On the first night, December 18th, over 200 SA-2 missiles were fired at the attacking bombers. 3 B-52s were shot down. On December 20th, the third night, North Vietnamese batteries salvoed concentrated missile barrages and shot down 6 B-52s, an appalling 7% attrition rate that could not be sustained. Everything changed during the Christmas Day bombing pause. Brigadier General Glenn Sullivan at Utapao had had enough of the rigid tactics that were costing lives and aircraft. He demanded fundamental tactical changes and sent recommended new tactics directly to the commander of Strategic Air Command. Strategic Air Command finally agreed to transfer detailed planning authority to 8th Air Force commanders who could respond to enemy tactics in real time. The revised approach employed multiple simultaneous attack routes at varying altitudes, compressed bomber streams to concentrate electronic jamming, and direct attacks on SA-2 storage and assembly sites. On Night 8 of the operation, December 26th, 120 bombers struck their targets via 7 different approach streams in the largest single combat launch in Strategic Air Command history. The varied tactics overwhelmed North Vietnamese defenses, which could not concentrate their missiles against multiple threats from different directions. By the final night of the operation, North Vietnam could fire only 23 surface-to-air missiles total. The operational statistics tell the story. 729 bomber sorties were completed over 11 nights. 15,237 tons of ordnance fell on 34 separate target complexes. 15 B-52s were shot down by enemy action. Of the 92 crew members aboard those aircraft, 26 were rescued, 33 became prisoners of war, 25 remain missing and presumed killed, and 8 were confirmed dead. The bombing destroyed an estimated 80% of North Vietnam's electrical power production capability. Railroad marshalling yards, petroleum storage facilities, communications centers, and military headquarters were systematically demolished. On December 29th, Hanoi agreed to resume peace negotiations. The Paris Peace Accords were signed on January 27, 1973. Two tail gunner victories during Linebacker. Two hold a unique place in aviation history. B-52s of that era still carried defensive armament, 450 caliber machine guns in a tail turret operated by a gunner who faced backward during the entire flight. On the first night of the operation, December 18th, Staff Sergeant Samuel Turner was manning the tail guns aboard a B-52D when North Vietnamese MiG-21 fighters attacked his formation. Turner tracked an incoming fighter, fired a burst from his quad 50 caliber guns, and shot down the MiG. It was the first confirmed B-52 air-to-air kill in history. 6 nights later, on Christmas Eve, Airman First Class Albert Moore sat in the tail gun position aboard a bomber nicknamed Diamond Lil. When MiG-21s attacked, Moore engaged and destroyed an enemy fighter with his machine guns. Albert Moore is recognized as the last bomber gunner in history to shoot down an enemy aircraft using machine guns in aerial combat. Diamond Lil survives today and stands on permanent display at the Air Force Academy in Colorado Springs. Over the entire Vietnam War, from June 1965 through August 1973, B-52s flew 126,615 combat sorties. They dropped approximately 1/3 of all the bombs used in the conflict. 31 B-52s were lost during the war, 18 to hostile fire, including missiles and fighters, and 13 to operational causes. Here lies perhaps the greatest irony in military aviation history. By the time the B-52 entered operational service in 1955, the United States Air Force was already designing its replacement. In February 1965, the legendary General Curtis LeMay testified to Congress that the B-52 was going to fall apart on them before they could get a replacement for it. A front-page article in 1966 confidently predicted that all B-52s would need to retire by 1975. 5 different aircraft were specifically designed to replace the B-52 over the following 4 decades. Every single one of them either failed outright during development or will be retired before the aircraft they were designed to replace. The Convair B-58 Hustler entered service in 1960 and was retired by 1970 after just 10 years of operation. It was an elegant supersonic bomber capable of speeds exceeding Mach 2, but it suffered from crippling limitations. It had only half the B-52's combat range. Its operating costs ran 3 times higher. Most damning, the B-58 suffered a catastrophic accident rate of over 22% over its brief service life, with 26 of the original 116 aircraft destroyed in crashes. It never dropped a single bomb in combat. The North American XB-70 Valkyrie was perhaps the most visually stunning aircraft ever designed, a massive delta wing bomber capable of Mach 3 at 70,000 feet. Its proponents argued it could outrun any Soviet interceptor or missile. President Eisenhower himself was deeply skeptical of the program and called the proposed mission questionable. Soviet SA-2 missiles had already demonstrated they could reach extreme altitudes, and the development of new interceptors made the Valkyrie's speed advantage irrelevant. Only 2 prototypes were ever built. One was destroyed in a mid-air collision during a photo shoot on June 8, 1966, killing 2 people. The General Dynamics FB-111A was a compromise solution, a strategic variant of the controversial F-111 tactical fighter bomber. Originally, the Air Force planned to purchase 263 aircraft. Budget constraints and technical problems reduced the final order to just 76. The FB-111's limited range and modest payload capacity made it inadequate as a true strategic bomber replacement, and it was retired in 1991. The Rockwell B-1 program had 2 separate lives. The original B-1A was a sophisticated variable geometry bomber designed to penetrate Soviet defenses at supersonic speeds and low altitude. President Jimmy Carter cancelled the program in 1977, citing spiraling costs. Carter had also been secretly briefed on revolutionary stealth technology that promised to make the B-1A obsolete before it entered service. President Ronald Reagan resurrected the program in 1981 as the B-1B Lancer, with modified avionics and reduced supersonic capability but improved radar cross-section characteristics. 100 B-1Bs were built at approximately $317 million each, 4 times the inflation-adjusted cost of a B-52. The supreme irony is what happened after the Cold War. Under strategic arms reduction treaties, the B-1B lost its nuclear mission entirely, while the older B-52 retained its nuclear cruise missile capability. The B-1 fleet, battered by structural fatigue from decades of intensive conventional combat operations in the Middle East and Afghanistan, is now being systematically retired. The last B-1B will leave service before the B-52. The Northrop Grumman B-2 Spirit stealth bomber represents the absolute pinnacle of aircraft technology. First flown in 1989, the flying wing design is virtually invisible to radar and can penetrate the most sophisticated air defenses. Originally, the Air Force planned to purchase 132 aircraft. Congressional opposition and the end of the Cold War capped final production at just 21 bombers. Each B-2 cost approximately $2.13 billion, making it the most expensive aircraft ever built. Operating costs run between $135,000 and $200,000 per flight hour, 3 to 4 times the B-52's costs. The B-2 requires climate-controlled hangars to maintain its radar-absorbent coating and specialized maintenance crews. It is scheduled to retire by 2032, years before the B-52. Even the newest American bomber, the B-21 Raider, which made its first flight in November 2023, is explicitly not designed to replace the B-52. Air Force plans call for a complementary 2-bomber force of B-21 Raiders for penetrating contested airspace, and modernized B-52Js, serving as standoff missile platforms through the 2050s and beyond. The pattern across 7 decades reveals a fundamental truth about why the B-52 survived when every replacement failed. Each successor was designed around a specific technological advantage, whether supersonic speed, extreme altitude, or stealth characteristics. Those advantages invariably proved either too expensive to scale to useful fleet sizes, too fragile to maintain under operational conditions, or too narrowly focused to adapt when missions changed. The B-52's genius lies in its fundamental generality. Its enormous airframe, designed with massive structural margins typical of 1950s engineering, accommodates virtually any weapon system ever conceived for it, and many that did not exist when the aircraft was designed. Its range and endurance exceed every aircraft built to replace it. It can perform nuclear deterrence, conventional precision strike, maritime patrol, anti-ship warfare, mine-laying, psychological operations, and close air support for ground troops. The B-52H flying combat missions today shares its basic airframe and wing structure with the aircraft that rolled off the Wichita assembly line in the early 1960s, but virtually nothing else inside remains original. The interior reveals visible layers of modifications accumulated over 6 decades, a geological record of technological evolution written in wiring bundles, black boxes, and upgraded displays. The weapons evolution alone spans the entire arc of modern warfare. In the 1950s, B-52s carried nuclear gravity bombs and AGM-28 Hound Dog nuclear cruise missiles. The 1960s brought conventional iron bombs for Vietnam. The 1970s introduced the AGM-69 short-range attack missile for nuclear delivery. The 1980s saw the revolutionary AGM-86 air-launched cruise missile, which gave the B-52 true standoff capability to launch nuclear weapons from hundreds of miles outside enemy defenses. The 1990s and 2000s brought GPS-guided joint direct attack munitions that transformed unguided bombs into precision weapons. The AGM-158 Joint Air-to-Surface Standoff Missile Family, laser-guided paveway bombs, a GM-84 Harpoon anti-ship missiles, and quick-strike naval mines. Today, engineers are integrating the AGM-181 long-range standoff weapon, a next-generation nuclear cruise missile, and hypersonic weapons capable of speeds exceeding Mach 5. The most significant current upgrade is the commercial engine replacement program. The B-52H's 8 Pratt & Whitney TF-33 turbofan engines have powered these aircraft since their original delivery in the early 1960s. The engines are no longer manufactured, forcing the Air Force to cannibalize parts from retired aircraft and maintain an increasingly strained supply chain. The replacement engines are Rolls-Royce F-130s, commercial power plants based on the BR-725 that propels the Gulfstream G650 business jet. The contract covers 608 engines. The new engines will deliver 30% better fuel efficiency, while requiring no overhaul during their entire service life on the B-52. The fully upgraded aircraft will receive the new designation B-52J, combining new engines, an advanced electronically scanned array radar, modernized communication systems, upgraded cockpit displays, and expanded weapons integration. Total modernization costs will approach $48.6 billion, a substantial investment but a fraction of what developing and building a replacement fleet would require. Perhaps no statistic captures the B-52's extraordinary longevity more powerfully than the multi-generational families who have served aboard these aircraft across the decades. At Minot Air Force Base in North Dakota, Colonel Don Sprague flew every B-52 variant from the A model through the H during his distinguished career. He earned the Distinguished Flying Cross for combat missions over North Vietnam and rose to command the 23rd Bomb Squadron at Minot in the early 1970s. His son-in-law, Lieutenant Colonel Don Welch, flew B-52s during the tense Cold War nuclear alert era of the 1980s, and in January 2011, Lieutenant Colonel Welch's son, Captain Daniel Welch, arrived at Minot to join the same 23rd Bomb Squadron his grandfather had commanded 4 decades earlier. 3 generations of one family, all flying the same basic aircraft type. The bombers themselves carry their own generational stories. Staff Sergeant Mark James became a maintenance crew chief on B-52, tail number 0062 in 1973. In 2019, the Air Force invited James back to visit the same aircraft, which was still in active service. He found her little changed externally from the bomber he had maintained as a young man. 2 aircraft resurrected from long-term storage at the aircraft boneyard at Davis-Monthan Air Force Base in Arizona embody the B-52's refusal to die. The bomber, nicknamed Ghost Rider, tail number 61007, became the first B-52H ever regenerated from desert storage back to active combat duty, completing restoration at Tinker Air Force Base in 2016. Wise Guy, tail number 60034, had been retired in August 2008 with over 17,000 accumulated flight hours, when a different B-52 crashed at Andersen Air Force Base in Guam in May 2016. The Air Force needed a replacement to maintain congressionally mandated force levels. They turned to Wise Guy. Maintenance crews working to restore the aircraft found a handwritten note left in the cockpit. The note had been written by Captain Aaron Hedrick when he delivered the aircraft to storage 8 years earlier. It read that this was tail number 60034, a cold warrior that stood sentinel over America from the darkest days of the Cold War to the global fight against terror. It asked future readers to take good care of her until she was needed again. The restoration cost approximately $30 million and required 550 personnel working over months. Wise Guy returned to operational service at Minot Air Force Base in March 2021. Lieutenant Colonel Hedrick, the same pilot who had written that note years earlier, flew the aircraft back to active duty. The B-52's post-Vietnam combat career demonstrated remarkable adaptability across dramatically different conflicts and missions. Operation Desert Storm began in January 1991, with those 7 B-52s launching from Barksdale on their record-breaking 35-hour mission. The crews faced the challenge of maintaining combat readiness over nearly a day and a half of continuous flight, navigating across multiple time zones, coordinating with tanker aircraft on precise schedules, and then delivering their weapons with split-second accuracy. Most of the crew members had never flown a mission lasting more than 12 hours before this operation. Over the 43-day campaign to liberate Kuwait, 68 B-52G models flew 1,741 combat sorties and dropped 27,000 tons of munitions. That represented approximately 30% of all coalition ordnance delivered during the war, while the bombers comprised only 3% of participating combat aircraft. Interviews conducted with Iraqi prisoners after the war revealed the devastating psychological impact of B-52 strikes. The distinctive approach pattern of the bombers, the earth-shaking detonations that could be felt from miles away, and the total unpredictability of the attacks created widespread fear throughout Iraqi military units. Approximately 24% of Iraqi soldiers surveyed said B-52 bombing was a significant factor in their decision to desert or surrender. In September 1996, two B-52Hs flew a 34-hour round trip from Andersen Air Force Base to launch cruise missiles against targets near Baghdad in Operation Desert Strike. During Operation Allied Force against Serbia in 1999, B-52s launched cruise missiles from standoff positions outside Yugoslav airspace on the opening night of the campaign, March 24. The October 2001 invasion of Afghanistan following the September 11 attacks marked perhaps the most radical reinvention of the B-52's tactical role. Bombers deployed from Diego Garcia in the Indian Ocean and began performing precision close air support for small teams of special operations forces on the ground, a mission no one had imagined for a strategic bomber. Working with soldiers who transmitted target coordinates via satellite, B-52s loitered at high altitude for hours and delivered GPS-guided munitions with precision accuracy against enemy positions. During the Battle of Tora Bora in December 2001, B-52s dropped guided bombs and massive explosives against Al-Qaeda cave complexes in the White Mountains near the Pakistan border. In March 2003, B-52s participated in Operation Iraqi Freedom, contributing to the largest cruise missile strike in history on the night of March 21st, when approximately 100 missiles struck military targets around Baghdad. The B-52 returned to sustained Middle East combat operations in April 2016, when 6 aircraft deployed to Al Udeid Air Base in Qatar to join the campaign against the Islamic State. By early 2017, those bombers had delivered over 3,400 weapons against enemy positions in Iraq and Syria. The B-52's projected service life of approximately 105 years stands alone in military aviation history. No other combat aircraft comes close to this longevity. The nearest comparison is Russia's Tupolev Tu-95 Bear, a turboprop-powered strategic bomber that also first flew in 1952. The Bear remains in Russian service and is expected to continue operating until approximately 2040. That represents impressive longevity, but falls roughly 20 years short of current B-52 planning. What makes the B-52 absolutely unique is that the same physical aircraft, not new production but the original airframes, will have served for nearly a century by the time they are finally retired. The youngest B-52H in the fleet will be approximately 98 years old if it serves until the projected 2060 retirement date. To understand what that means in practical terms, consider that if an aircraft flying today were 100 years old, it would have been built in 1924. Aircraft from that era were constructed of canvas stretched over wooden frames, held together with wire bracing. They had open cockpits exposed to the elements. Their landing gear did not retract. The idea that such a machine could perform combat missions in the modern era is unthinkable. Today, 76 B-52H models serve with 3 wings. The second bomb wing operates from Barksdale Air Force Base in Louisiana. The 5th bomb wing flies from Minot Air Force Base in North Dakota. The 307th Bomb Wing, an Air Force Reserve unit, is also based at Barksdale. These aircraft deploy worldwide, from Andersen Air Force Base in Guam to Royal Air Force Fairford in England to Al Udeid in Qatar, demonstrating American global reach and commitment to allies. Their missions span nuclear deterrence with cruise missiles and gravity bombs, conventional precision strike, support for ground forces, maritime operations, and continuous bomber presence deployments designed to demonstrate capability to potential adversaries. The B-52 Stratofortress was conceived in a Dayton hotel room over a single October weekend in 1948 by 6 determined engineers with balsa wood and silver paint. It was manufactured during the Eisenhower administration by workers who are now great-grandparents or have passed from this earth entirely. This aircraft stood nuclear alert during the Cuban Missile Crisis when humanity came closest to extinction. It carpet-bombed the jungles of Vietnam. It launched cruise missiles in Desert Storm and dropped precision munitions on terrorist strongholds in Afghanistan and Syria. It has outlived the Hustler, the Valkyrie, the FB-111, the B-1, and will outlive the B-2. It has served under 14 American presidents. It has carried thermonuclear weapons capable of ending human civilization. A young pilot graduating from flight school today could spend an entire 30-year career flying B-52s and retire before the aircraft does. The children of that pilot could also become B-52 aviators. So could their children. There is a saying among bomber crews that captures this impossible, unmatched, utterly unique longevity. The last B-52 pilot has not been born yet. Given current projections, that statement might actually be true.